So just a handful of questions. The first relates to the potential for differences in the prevalence of infections in the general population in different parts of the United Kingdom. And the question is this: to what extent does the available data show variation in the prevalence rates of infections for A, HIV, B, hepatitis C, within the general population as between the different parts of the UK? If the answer is you don't know, which may be the answer.
I think the answer is we don't know. It's potentially different according to which year you're talking about. And so I don't think we can give a comprehensive answer to that.
Well, that deals with that one nice and sharply in that case.
I would just add that you would need to be specific about the prevalence also by age, gender, and calendar date. It will be varying by each of those.
The next question relates to the modelling exercise, and I think this is task 2. So we're on chapter 4. And if I just go back to yes, so in terms of units of donated. So the question is this: you explained that in your statistical model for how many people had been infected with hepatitis C through transfusion, you looked for the number of units donated, and I think we talked about a figure of 2 million for one particular year. And you explained you also had to work out the number of units transfused. The question is about the methodology for the calculation of units transfused figure. Is the modelling for that figure calculated simply by reference to the units donated figure?
We got donations, and we have some figures reported on returned donations in terms of, and but broadly speaking, yes, it's working out a donation figure and a return figure, and assuming the rest were transfused. Probably an overestimate because of just wastage, which is not reported. It's not recorded. So there's a judgment there. If anything, it would probably slightly overestimate the number of units transfused.
And then the final question relates to page 77 of the report. So that's electronic page 81, please, Lawrence. And it's back to the data referred to in paragraph 4.109. Professor Burban, I was asking you about this. You referred, as does the report, to the fact that of the 900, there were 924 patients infected with HCV against 443 patients who had received an HCV-implicated transfusion but were not HCV antibody positive. And the question is this: does that affect the appropriateness of the assumption that everyone who received an implicated unit would be infected?
No, I don't think it there is this is different from the assumption in the modelling where we're, as it were, simulating infection. Here, the people who, an implicated donor is somebody who was subsequently, who was shown to be hepatitis C antibody positive, but we don't know whether they were infectious at each of their previous donations. And so, in general, people didn't know when they became HCV antibody positive and or whether they were infectious. So I don't think it is, as it were, fortunate that not all of those past infections, past donations were infectious, and that's how we have the benefit of this case control study.
Those are the questions I was proposing to ask that have been suggested, the additional questions. So do you have questions for the
I have just one question, and it arises in this way. It would be useful to me to know that I'm on sound ground if I express in the final report a conclusion drawn from your research and your work as to the total number of deaths, give or take, which have occurred as a result of the infections of HCV and HIV in both the haemophilia cohort, if I can call it that, and the transfusee cohort. In other words, what's the overall picture? In order to do this, I wonder whether this is an acceptable route or whether you can simply tell me. But if we look at the executive summary, and we go to page 1, please, can we, of the report. Well, it's page 1 of the report, internal page 1 of the report. The next page, please. Thank you, Lawrence. And can we go beyond that to the executive summary? The next page. Thank you. If you look underneath table ES1, you say this: we conclude that about 1,250 people with bleeding disorders were infected with HIV in the UK between 1970 and 1991. Around 3/4 of these have died, and around half, now that would be 625, have died of HIV-related causes. And that fits pretty well with the 639 in the UK HCDO data cohort. So we start then with, at this stage, with 625, could be more, could be less, but that's the central figure. To add to the HIV infections in that cohort, if we go to page 3, we've got the question of HIV infections in transfusion recipients. Now, there, at least 79 and possibly up to 100, and that was explored by counsel during the evidence, people were infected with HIV through blood transfusions between 1970 and 1991. Around 85% have subsequently died, but we don't know the causes of death. Now, if one assumes, and I want to know whether this assumption is a fair one, that the percentage of deaths is roughly half, because that's what it was for the UK Haemophilia Centre directors. I'm wrong, obviously. Tell me.
Not necessarily wrong,
Not
sir.
necessarily.
But those who were HIV infected through transfusion will in general have been substantially older at the time of their infection than those who were infected through, who were persons with bleeding disorders. And so that influences the underlying force of mortality, as indeed does the fact that they are transfusion recipients. And so it may be that the UKHSA has some additional information. We did not ask them for further information about the cause of death of those who had died here.
Yeah, that's very helpful. There will be some addition made by those who received HIV from transfusions. What is the likely range?
As you can tell, we're very reluctant to put numbers on things where there's so much judgment involved. And I even don't like a range. I mean, I would say roughly around 40 or something like that deaths would be a reasonable figure, but I don't like to.
I think it's going to be less than 50 on the basis of the 48%, as you've said in table ES1. And I would say, given what Sheila says, quite a lot of the people who've had transfusions will have died through the reason why they had their transfusion. So it's going to be very, very difficult to get at that in terms of the cause. But I would say at least 20 of them.
Yeah.
But that would be where I would go from. But I'm doing that as a number
Yeah.
plucked out of the air.
Yeah,
And
30 to
I have one of
40,
my
I don't
colleagues agreeing. That's a kind of lower limit.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't disagree with 40. I wouldn't disagree with. If somebody said to me it was only 20, I couldn't argue strongly against that. I might be able to do the sums that made an estimation of the rate of mortality, because as we all know, mortality goes up so dramatically with age. All right. One of the things that we had discussed is that David and I were involved in a paper on COVID, and we essentially showed that COVID, at the peak of the epidemic, was probably increasing mortality across all ages and all sexes from certainly about 12 or 13 right up to the highest ages, and for both men and women, by about 40%, a hazard ratio of 1.4, and that was fairly constant. Now, my suspicion is there will be something that is a similar thing, but the problem is you've got to take into account the underlying distribution of the age and sex there. So it could be that a lot of these people were dying for causes otherwise,
Yeah.
but I think that their being infected will have increased their mortality. And so it certainly wouldn't be zero.
No. And one bears in mind that the gender may matter here.
Yes.
But if one takes your minimum figure, back of the
I wouldn't
envelope.
want to be quoted on it.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to be quoted. I'll write things down in private, but I don't want to be quoted on.
Well, I think I heard you say it won't be
Just
less than
between
20.
you and me.
Just between you and the stenographer.
If it were, let me hypothesize, if it were not less than 20, it would be up to 645 at this stage. Having looked at HIV, then we turn to HCV to add those on. Do I understand from page 2? Thank you. That this chart, this table, does not double count any of the deaths which are referred to in table 1. So these are all additional deaths. And in those, we see that so far as the HCDO report is concerned, now the other two don't give estimates, it's about 40%. I say about 40% because the maths is easier. And 40% of 700 is, what, 280? So it's between 280 and then a possible additional 560.
Yes, the Skipton Fund could have some double counting in it. So it wouldn't, is that I think?
Yeah, but if we just use the 2,400 to 5,000 range, then.
So the math, the arithmetic would be right. Would it be a fair representation?
May I just clarify that the National Haemophilia Database is essentially a subset of the information from the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation report.
Very well.
So
They say 536.
yes, for a subset of the sort of well documented. So from this table, you might be looking at, from the top row, a summation of about 2,100 deaths, a certain proportion of which would be HCV related. And in this context, HCV related will mean hepatocellular carcinoma or HCV-related liver disease. So it would not include, as we do with the transfusion people, those whose heart disease, deaths from heart disease or kidney disease or intracranial bleeds might have been contributed to by hepatitis C.
But I mean, the complexity is that, in a way, the death rate among the possibles is a lot higher than the death rate among the confirmed, because they were done, you know, they had considerable longer period before, when less information was available, and so these are not comparable groups in this way.
I follow. So even putting a figure on it is not easy.
Not at all.
But again, it's a similar sort of question to the one that you weren't very happy about answering, but did in respect of the last cohort. What figure can maybe be reasonably confident within all the limitations of the data, as saying the total number of deaths between 1970 and or probably 2020, arising out of HCV infections in those with bleeding disorders?
Well, I guess from those figures, we would say somewhere between 280 and 40% of 2,100, which is 820. But that, you know, it's a huge range.
I think also, for the reasons that Sheila has said, that 39% is relative to the other things we've done, likely to be an underestimate.
Yes, so it looks then as though we have at probably at least 550 more deaths, do we, here, or is it higher?
Or higher.
Higher.
Yes, it's moving up to 1,000.
So we're over 1,000, aren't we? We're about 1,200 by now. And then we have yet to turn to the one which is modelled in page 4, where we have 1,820 as the estimate.
With a lot of uncertainty.
With a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, I was going to say that we're actually able to estimate the uncertainty there by reason of the modelling statistics that we do, because we have that kind of distribution, and we can say we've modelled things over this range, and we can say 95%. Or if we were to do the same for the things we've just discussed, it would have this big uncertainty around it.
Yeah.
But does it look, as a result of putting these four groups together and trying to answer the question that I began with, saying what does one say so far as the inquiry is concerned with the overall number of deaths caused by what has happened, it's going to be around, with a very big, around in capital letters, 3,000.
Yes,
That's the figure I was going to say, 3,000, with a lot I'm
I think
perfectly
it's a
happy
bit more.
for you to give us evidence if you wish. Okay.
Maybe this is.
If I may say, you know, the calculations, I mean, if you look through the numbers that were just mentioned, it was a little bit more than 3,000 plus the consideration that Sheila,
So at least 3,000.
I would say so.
So the evidence that you're able to give suggests, and I use the word suggests for obvious reasons, that the total number of deaths is at least 3,000.
You couldn't say at least 3,000.
Not confident about that.
Because there is uncertainty at the lower end as well as
Yeah.
at the higher end.
Yeah.
I wonder whether this is something that we should make an attempt among our group to try and think about more carefully and include in a letter to you.
I think that would be really very useful. That if the questions I put were answered in a considered way, rather than I'm afraid I put you on the spot
that would be
today for obvious reasons, and it's not as simple as going through the tables and adding up the figures for the reasons that you've just been given.
And may I add that putting the two sources of the infections together obscures the fact that for those who have bleeding disorders, the majority are male who were affected, whereas for those who survived the first 10 years post-transfusion and suffered HCV-related deaths, the majority is female.
Yes.
These are important epidemiological considerations that are rather subsumed if you put these two importantly different groups together.
Well, thank you for that. I would not, I think, wish to simply say just that.
Yes, no.
For obvious reasons, but what you've said is very helpful. Ms. Richards.
Yes, not a question so much as almost a submission from me, I'm afraid, but or an observation in relation to the HIV death figures. If we take the HIV infections in transfusion recipients, it may be that the inquiry can do some further work looking back through the Eileen Trust files. That will only be obviously some, not all of them, because we know there were people who did not register with the Eileen Trust, people who died beforehand, and so on. But we certainly may have information about numbers of deaths. And I mention that simply because I don't pretend to be familiar with every single one of the files. But from those which I am familiar with, the vast majority of the deaths I recall were age-related.
Yes.
Were age-related deaths. So maybe that's some work that the inquiry can do, looking back at the Eileen Trust figures, because the numbers are small and because we have some data at least about individual cases.
Can we do both? And plainly the inquiry will share whatever data it has with you, and by all means do ask, as before, the inquiry for such data as we can give.
And so, sorry, an observation then about Chapter 1, the figure there, the 639 or 48%, and bearing in mind that's set against a figure of deaths of 1,017. As I understand it from the panel's evidence earlier, that figure of 639, the 48%, is likely to be an underestimate because it's drawn from death certification. And I just wanted to pull out a couple of further points and check that I'm not going down the wrong lines with the panel, if I may. So there will be AIDS-related deaths that have not been captured in that figure because the death certificate didn't say HIV or AIDS. Would it be right also to understand this, that a number within, or all within this cohort who are HIV infected through bleeding disorders are also infected with hepatitis C.
Yes,
And so there may well have been some deaths from hepatitis C which will not be captured in the 639 because that 639 looks for AIDS or HIV only.
That is correct.
And they're not caught in Table 2 because Table 2 excluded all those who were co-infected.
Correct.
So that's an additional factor to bear in mind, sir.
Yes, well, thank you for that as well. It's not an easy one. It is one which needs thought. I've set the hair running. And it's not, I think, a false hair at all. It's an important issue, particularly to bring home to those who may read the report the gravity of what has occurred, which I am happy to, or not happy, I wish to emphasize.
Can I just say that, you know, I come up with numbers like 20 as an absolute minimum for the range and so on, but I think that it's very important that we consider it carefully in showing respect to the core participants, that we don't want to regard this as trivial and playing with numbers. We're dealing with things that involve the tragedies, and we need to do it as carefully as we can. But even when we've been as careful as we can, as you're aware, there will still be enormous uncertainty in trying to give numbers. And it's one of the things is to actually talk about all-cause mortality. And if we can, to estimate all-cause mortality, as we have done in other circumstances, in the general population, so that we could look at, if we could, excess deaths of all causes, rather than trying to focus on what was on a death certificate, whether it was someone with HIV dying of an HCV-related cause, and allowing for the fact that people won't have understood what the cause was for many of these people, sadly.
Thank you very much.
That concludes the questions then. And is there anything any of the panel wishes to add?
Could I just add one thing that I just would like to give my thanks to the entire Infected Blood Inquiry team, who have been enormously helpful. And as I said, our team have done a huge amount of work on this, as you can tell, and I admire the audience who have endured giving our evidence. But I'd really like to thank, I've got to make sure I got my little list here, Maura Flannery, Tom Dunning, Annabelle Sharma, Conor Mitten, Michelle Secker and Ellie Brooks, among the whole team, who have been extraordinarily helpful and patient with us in our constant demands for more evidence, more data. And as you can tell, it's been, almost, kind of like a detective, a work of detection to try to actually find out all the bits of evidence that have contributed to our argument.
And may I add specifically our thanks to Ruth McCabe and Sarah Hayes for the immense amount of work that they did in contributing to the report.
I would, say that the thanks are really due to you, you three, those who are here as well, and I think I should mention you by name. We have Sarah Hayes and Ruth McCabe. We have Daniela De Angelis, Crystal Donnelly, and Graham Medley. Nicholas Jewell is not with us, but he is also an author of the report. Can I thank you all collectively, please, for the enormous work you've done. It has been, as this session has showed, of great importance to get a sense of the overview of it without losing sight, as you've been keen to emphasize, that this is real people and real people's lives we're talking about, and we're only focusing upon one part of it, which is mortality. And you've been conscious of that throughout, and you've been working plainly, heavily on COVID. So the time that you have been able to give us has been really very welcome, and you deserve the thanks of everyone who is here. Thank you.
Tomorrow's a shorter day anticipated.
And we start at 10.
We
10
start
o'clock.
at 10 with the evidence of we start at 10 with the evidence of Professor Manus from NHSBT talking about liver transplant, and then we have Professor Roberts talking about tranexamic acid.
Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow.